Mini episode 336 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by the Pullins Group, delivering public affairs consulting and marketing services for small businesses trying to grow. Follow them on the web at pullinsgroup.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge, mini episode number 336. It's a pleasure to be with you again today on the show where nothing is off topic. This is FDH managing partner Rick Morris. We've got a tremendous conversation coming up with a gentleman who's done an awful lot in his musical career, but I received a note prior to the show here reminding me to put him over for, among other things. Apparently, he was the source, I had forgotten about this, of a really great Red Wings CD that I had gotten a couple of years back. And I am a huge Red Wings guy, so I want to thank him for that before I even get into any of the substance of his music. He has had a tremendous career. He started on the always very interesting Georgia music scene, joined Bay Area Jefferson Starship in 1979, and was along for the big run of hits that they had in the 1980s, the very big revival of the group. It's very interesting that the Bay Area, we've probably had on more musical guests from that area than anywhere else, and it's really strange because this program doesn't have any kind of organic connections to the area, but when you start with the four members of Journey that we've had on from time to time and you take it from there, then we've had more of a connection to the Bay Area probably than just about anywhere else with this program. Speaking of which, a side note on that, as far as it goes with Journey, this came up when we had Steve Perry on the program. What we're going to do with this conversation today, as we did with the Steve Perry conversation, is respect the fact that I always try to find a tactful way to phrase things. Hopefully I get this part right, that the lineage sometimes of these really big groups kind of splits and goes a couple of different ways. We're here to talk today about the project that this gentleman has and that he's been involved with Starship featuring Mickey Thomas. If he wants to talk about anything else that any previous bandmates have been working on or doing, that's fine. That's his prerogative. But we're going to respect what he's doing and confine it to there until such time as he steers it in another direction. So we got some people wondering previously when Steve Perry was on, why didn't we ask about Journey? Well, again, you always want to respect the artist, what they're doing, and kind of let them take it wherever they want to take it. Before we bring them on, just two examples to tell you about when a band gets as big as they did in the 1960s and then again in the 1980s in the way that they kind of penetrate popular consciousness. Two quick examples for you. One from earlier this week. I'm sitting there in the party room of a local sports bar getting ready for my fantasy hoops draft. And the games aren't on yet, so they're just playing classic rock on the speakers. I think it was one of these Sirius XM channels. And I'm sitting there. I got a little bit of extra time. Okay, let me start doing a little bit of prep for this conversation we're going to have later this week. Immediately, as I start looking at the materials for this gentleman and his group, they start playing Jane on the loudspeakers. I'm sitting there going, am I getting punked? Is this a practical joke? But, the music is out there. It's, it's pretty ubiquitous. You're bound to hear it from time to time. That was just a heck of a coincidence. The other thing that I definitely have to work in here, longtime close personal friend, mentor, big brother of mine, Scott Siegel, going all the way back to our college days. He always had probably the most, I'll use the word again, ubiquitous catchphrase in the group. It was something that he would raise from time to time about somebody, and it would always crack me up whenever he would manage to find a way to work this into conversation. So out of respect for my friend Scott Siegel, I'm working this in. I guess I've been waiting 20 years to say this ever since he used to invoke it back in the day. We're about to get knee-deep in the hoopla with Starship's Mickey Thomas. Mickey, it's a pleasure to have you on the FDH Lounge, sir. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. How are you doing?
Oh, doing great. Really pleased for the opportunity to talk to you and find out what's going on with your career and this great new CD. I really appreciate your people sending it out to us and giving us a chance to check it out. Just like to start kind of open-ended with you as far as where you feel like it fits in the progression of your career. What were some of the forces that were shaping some of the material that we hear on this CD?
Well, I guess it's I guess it's a natural progression in the sense that I tried to, so much has gone down in the last 20 years or so, in the time that it's been in between new Starship studio albums. I've stopped and started the project several times, of course, and then I kept running into roadblocks or running into a wall here and there, and a large part of it was my fault, because quite often I would find myself not clearly focused on, well, what kind of a Starship record do I want to make? What am I doing here? What should it be like? I think that sometimes, quite often, I was probably unconsciously trapped by the success of Starship in the mid to late 80s, and trying to have it in your mind that, well, I've got to recreate that sound, or I've got to do something that's more of a logical extension of, the big hits like We Built This City and Nothing's Going to Stop Us, so forth. And then after a while, I came to my senses and realized that, that was kind of fruitless, and I started to kind of assess my whole career, really, and all the things that I'd done and all the things that I wanted to do and the things that I enjoyed the most about my career. And then I realized, that was a very, very small section of time there, where we were fortunate enough with Knee Deep in the Hoopla to have, I think it was like 3 number one singles in the span of 18 months. But it was almost an anomaly, really, to all the other music that we created over the 15 years leading up to that, and then what I've been doing since then. So anyway, I just kind of cleared the table and said, I'm going to get back to basics. I'm going to go back to the core. I'm going to go back to what I started out doing in the 70s, and I just wanted to make a rock and roll record, I wanted it to be very organic. I wanted it to be edgy. I wanted it to be a little darker in tone maybe than people would be expecting from a Starship album, and just get back to the core and get back to basics. I wanted to make a record that felt like a 70s record. And hopefully I achieved that.
Well, that's very interesting. I have 2 follow-up questions based on what you just said there. One based on the tone, but one based on the 1970s part. And again, and people can check out anything they want to learn about this, of course, at the official website, starshipcontrol.com. And that was one of the things I was reading there. And you actually lead with the part about the album saying that you wanted it to feel like a 1970s album.
Yeah.
And yet, in listening to it tonally, it certainly, to me, felt a lot like a 1980s album. So do you feel like it's a little bit of a merger in terms of the grittiness of the tone with the 80s sound, or was I completely hearing something outside the box there when I thought it sounded a little bit 80s to me?
No, I think you're right there, but I think it sounds 80s in the sense of not so much like Starship 80s, but maybe more, maybe more of the sort of grittier, rockier aspects of the 80s, which Starship, in the early 80s, with Find Your Way Back and No Way Out and Landing on the Line and, Stranger and songs of that ilk, were closer to what this record sounds like than the Starship of the mid-80s. So, that's one of the beautiful things to me about the 80s is the 80s were kind of all things. I was just talking to somebody the other day about how wonderful radio, pop, CHR radio was in the 80s, when, on the CHR charts in the mid-'80s, if you're listening to one of the more popular, I call it, CHR was Contemporary Hits Radio, which is essentially your Billboard, Top 100. And so in the 80s, you'd be listening to your favorite CHR station, and you might hear Whitney Houston, followed up by Whitesnake, followed up by the Thompson Twins, followed up by Starship, followed up by Journey, followed up by, whatever. In other words, the point is it was just wide open. Pop radio embraced all forms of music from one end of the spectrum to the other. And I think that was a real cool time in music.
It was. It was a very interesting time. But before I ask you to follow up about the tone of the album, one more question about that. And I would imagine that this is the kind of thing, it's probably much like any type of recipe that somebody is dissecting if they sit here and say, oh, is that a little bit of cinnamon in there or whatever? As I was listening for what I thought it sounded like, and I have the weird sense that this is far out of left field and probably nobody said this to you yet, but I almost thought, in terms of some of the ballads, I was almost getting a little bit of like 80s Firehouse in there. Has anybody else picked up on that?
No, but that is interesting, though. I mean, I myself, I'm not really that familiar with Firehouse. I mean, I know the name, you know, but you know,
Sure.
I wouldn't. I don't know if I could tell you a Firehouse song or not. So, but yeah, you know, I could hear that. I think that another thing that happened with my concept of trying to make it feel to me like a 70s album. Of course, there are going to be all those aspects of the 80s in there too, and I think that also that approach by trying to go further back also makes the album sound more modern in a sense. If you know what I'm saying, you know, because like a lot of the bands, a lot of the popular bands today remind me more of bands from the 70s than bands from the 80s, you know, as far as the yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, even bands like Muse, which are very prog rock, you know, you can kind of trace that back to some of the elements of the 70s too, with some of the prog, you know, the early prog rock bands, Yes, and bands like that and stuff. And but anyway, to get back to the Firehouse thing, part of that too could be the influence of Jeff Pilson in the record too. You know, Jeff Pilson produced the album and had a big hand in a lot of the songwriting, and Jeff was in Dokken all through the 90s and was one of the driving forces in Dokken, one of the creative forces in that band. So that might be a little bit of his influence creeping through there also.
I just had that kind of sense, and I can't quite put my finger on why, but I thought it was really kind of interesting as I was checking it out. Now, you used the word concept there, probably not in the way that I'm going to ask you about. Well, when we're talking about the tone of the album, it almost kind of felt like a concept album to me about breaking up. There seemed to be just this pervasive kind of thing throughout it, just about every tune in there, if not everyone, dealing with the shards of relationships. Was that a deliberate kind of a thing, or what were you going for there?
I don't think it was a deliberate thing, you know, initially or going into the album. But I think as the album started to take shape, I mean, obviously I was aware. I mean, you know, like, you know, looking at the album and looking at the personality that the album was taking on, and I could say, oh, well, this is love gone bad for the most part. A lot of the songs, and it is. That is kind of the overriding theme of the album is love gone wrong, and I think everyone can probably relate to that. I know I can. I mean, right now I'm at a really, really great place in my life as far as my own personal romance goes, and my love life is better than it's ever been by far in my life. But also, you know, there was the baggage that I've probably been carrying around for many, many years of relationships that didn't work out so well. And so you get a chance to kind of vent that. And a lot of the songs on this album, I enjoyed, like 2 or 3 of the songs are almost borderline angry, you know, where I kind of get almost to spit the lyric out a little bit as opposed to sing it. And that's kind of fun to do because it's something I haven't done a lot of, that kind of vocal styling, and it's probably something that people might not be expecting from Mickey Thomas either, that little bit of a darker edge to the performance, you know. So I enjoyed that.
Oh, that's the thing that a lot of people, I'm sure, can relate to is, you know, acting out these kinds of things through the music and touching upon those types of experiences. And you mentioned about Jeff Pilson being so integral to this album with the production of it. And in looking at his background, as you mentioned about previously with Dokken, also previous association with Dio, when I say I think I heard a little bit of, and maybe I'm using Firehouse more in a generic sense for that kind of 80s metal scene, of hearing some type of ballad-type influences in there, but was that a deliberate kind of fusion thing that you were going for in bringing him in? Because Jefferson Starship was very much a part of the 80s mainstream pop rock scene. Were you going for a little bit of fusion with somebody that's more associated with another element of what was big in the 80s? Well,
you know, as I mentioned, you know, I did want to, in going over in my head about what kind of record I wanted the Starship record to be, I did intentionally want to deconstruct what the last image would be in people's minds of Starship music and a Starship album, and I wanted to deconstruct that. I wanted to reinvent the band. I wanted to get back more to the rock roots of the band. So that was definitely a conscious effort. And bringing Jeff on certainly helped because, you mentioned Dio and Dokken. He's also been performing with Foreigner for the last 10 years or so. So there's a real great rock and roll background there, and he's got a rock and roll heart too. I mean, Jeff Pilson is the essence of rock and roll. He's just so much fun to work with. I don't know if you've ever talked to Jeff or met Jeff, but man, you talk about energetic, enthusiastic, exuberant, just a rock and roll animal. And he brought a lot of that attitude to the record. And when we first got together, the chemistry was immediate for me right from the get-go, that we were just like, okay, this is it. We're on the same page here. We know exactly what kind of record we want to make, and everything came into focus. And once it did come into focus, the record really, I was able to make it in a relatively short period of time.
Well, yeah, he's definitely got a tremendously varied background. I mean, anybody that could span those bands there, Dokken, Foreigner, and Dio, you're really going to be versatile to be able to do that. So yeah. I can see where that adds a lot of different elements just with one guy to what you're doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I liked and the songs too. Even some of the ballads, what attracted me to them was the fact that even the ballads were not fluffy or pop-oriented, Everything had this dark kind of underbelly to it. How do you sleep? Where did we go wrong? What did I do? Those kinds of themes. And as I've mentioned before, almost kind of a bitterness and a little bit of anger there. And Jeff seems to have this knack, too, of I noticed a lot of his songs when I was first listening to the demos. I was very impressed because it sounds real fresh. The song sounds obviously new and fresh and today, but at the same time, you almost feel like you're listening to a song that you've been hearing for 30 years on classic rock radio or something, His songs have that kind of nostalgic element to them.
That's what you want to go for, obviously, is the kind of timelessness that can kind of invoke. And when you're working with somebody like that, I can see where that would be coming right to the fore. But what's very interesting to me also about your career is that it's made up of so many of these types of collaborations, not least of which I know that you did some backing music previously with a good friend of the program that we've had on a bunch of times, Jimmy Jamison, and obviously he's such a tremendous musician himself, coming from a similar area of the country to where you were, and also being somebody with a real fondness for blues-oriented music. So what's that like, the ability to get together with someone of like mind and put some stuff together? And, that must just be one of the greatest things in the world when you're able to do something like that.
Yeah, it really, really, truly is, And I mean, when you mentioned Jimmy, I just noticed that as soon as you said his name, I've got a big smile came across my face. He's such a great guy and such a sweetheart. And it is, Jimmy and I have done many things together over the past, 30 years now. I guess that we've known each other.
Wow.
Back in the early 80s, we used to, I would pop in the studio and do some background vocals with Jimmy on some of the Survivor albums, and we used to call ourselves, because, as you mentioned, Jimmy's from Memphis. I grew up in South Georgia, so we used to call ourselves the Ridge Runners, which only sometimes people from the South would understand. The Ridge Runners, were like people that were like running illegal moonshine, across the ridge at night.
Classic.
And, so, I've had the opportunity to work with Jimmy, many other guys of my ilk, Bobby Kimball I've done a lot of stuff with over the years. Mike Reno is another good friend, John Cafferty, just so many guys. And we just always have a great time whenever we do get to, I've done these shows called Starship and Friends. Sometimes we call it that, sometimes we call it Voices of Classic Rock, that we've been doing for 15 years now, where we all get together, and my concept was, when I was growing up in South Georgia, I loved soul music. And back in the late 60s, you'd go and see a rhythm and blues review where there'd be a house band and then, maybe 4, 5, 6 singers, and each singer would come out and do 3 or 4 of their hits, and as they're leaving one side of the stage, the next singer is entering the stage from the other side, and it never misses a beat. And I thought, well, why can't we do a classic rock review of the, based on the same concept? So the Starship became the house band, and then I would get, Jimmy and Mike and Bobby and Cafferty, Dave Jenkins from Pablo Cruz is a buddy that did a lot of this with us, Wally Palmer from the Romantics, and so we just had a real blast over the years doing that kind of stuff.
Bobby Kimball is somebody else we've had on the program. Very sweet man. I have to say that's the closest I think I ever came to being a mic stand. I think I got 3 words in twice the whole time. Heck of a storyteller that guy is. I'm sure you're probably reliving some of the yarns in your head, but yeah, that's a guy that you just wind him up and he can tell stories all day long, and that's just got to be so cool to be able to collaborate with a lot of people like that. But you talk about your background and where you came from. You go from there to when you had really the apex happening there in the 80s. You joined Jefferson Starship, of course, in 1979, and there you are, an adopted son now of the Bay Area, and with this large countercultural icon group from the 60s, no less. So was that any kind of a culture shock going to the Bay Area and being front and center with that group?
Well, it was, but the good part is that I was already living in the San Francisco Bay Area, because right before the Jefferson Starship, I originally moved out to California to join up with the Elvin Bishop Band. And I spent, 3.5 years with the Elvin Bishop Band, through the mid to late 70s. And we were based in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. So, that was kind of my first big break. When I was with the Elvin Bishop Band, I was lucky enough to record Fooled Around and Fell in Love. So that was my first, really big hit single with my voice on it. And, of course, I'm still trying to educate people today that it was actually me singing the song, not Elvin Bishop. It's still, I do that every night in the live show, and it still surprises, people, a lot of people in the audience when they go, oh, wow, okay, now I get it. He sang that song. So anyway, I was living in the Bay Area, and I had just left the Elvin Bishop Band and was planning on pursuing a solo career and getting ready to go into the studio to make a solo album when in early 1979 I got the call from the Jefferson Starship asking me if I was interested, which completely blew me away because I didn't really know any of the people from Starship, and I was thinking like, oh, I'm coming out of the Elvin Bishop Band, and they're coming right off of Miracles and Runaway and Count on Me, and then there's the whole Jefferson Airplane thing, and I'm thinking, how is this going to work out? But I thought it piqued my interest, so I said, well, yeah, let's. I'd be happy to meet with you. So I went, I met with the band, and we hung out and we talked, and over in Paul Kentner's living room, and we did some jamming there, and then I was still very hesitant though about hooking up because there was at that point in time Grace Slick had left the band, Marty Ballin had left the band, the drummer John Barbetta had been in a horrible car crash, so there was a lot of question about whether or not the Jefferson Starship would even continue on as a band, but. Part of what made it easier for me is the same time that that I was coming on, they had to have a new drummer too. So Ainsley Dunbar was joining up at the same time. So there were sort of 2 new guys coming in, and that made it easier for each one of us, I think. And it also felt kind of like a brand new band, with Grace and Marty leaving, and then Ainsley coming in, with his background and his track record as being a real rock icon drummer, and then my bluesy R&B Elvin Bishop background, and so it made for an interesting synthesis. And fortunately, we came out with what I think at the time was a pretty original sound when Jane was our first single off the album, and that kind of became our calling card. So somehow it worked.
Absolutely. Well, as I referenced today, you're bound to hear that tune on the radio at any point in time, as I did just the other day. So, yeah, I mean, it's had that kind of lasting impact. But when you came in there, and again, we talked about before the concept of chemistry and how sometimes it comes immediately, sometimes you have to work to develop it, regardless of how long it took to really get that kind of chemistry going with these guys in this established band. Did it come as a really big shock to you when the band blew up for a second time? You were coming into an established unit, something that's been really big at one time previously as Jefferson Airplane. And again, this doesn't often happen. Lightning doesn't often strike twice for a band in the way that it did. Could you kind of see it coming with the way that the music and the material was coming together, and I think this was really going to pop big, or was it really kind of a shock?
Well, it was a shock that it popped as big as it did. I did realize that we had reached a point to where we had to reinvent the band by the mid-'80s, and most of the band was all on the same page as far as what that reinvention would take the form of and how we wanted to go about it and where we wanted to take it, and the holdout was kind of Paul Kantner. So when we had our split with Paul in 1984, and then we were getting ready to go into the studio for the Knee Deep in the Hoopla album, and being after the split with Paul occurred, the remaining members of the band, we were all on the same page, and we all felt like this tremendous weight had kind of been lifted off of our shoulders, and we were like kids in a toy store when we went into the studio to make Knee Deep in the Hoopla. And I'm not saying, I'm not putting all the blame on Paul, but I'm just saying, anytime you have a situation where, X amount of people on one side of the fence and there's one guy that's on the other side of the fence, and there's this struggle going on, this conflict, once you can eliminate the conflict, then you're just going to feel a lot better about life in general.
Sure.
So that's what happened. And then we knew that we wanted to explore different recording techniques. We wanted to take advantage of all the new toys that were available to us, all of the electronics, all of the technology, the sampling, the sequencing, the synclavier, everything that brought with it. I mean, it was exciting for us. And now, did I think that it was going to explode like it did with We Built This City and Sarah, back-to-back number one singles? No, I did not. As a matter of fact, we Built This City. I never even envisioned that song as a single. Period. My friend Martin Page gave me a demo of that song, and he had written it with Bernie Taupin, and I thought, well, this is a really quirky, interesting little song here, with kind of an edgy thing. The lyric in the verses is really quite dark and very deep, and so I would have never imagined it being a single. Now, the part that probably made it a single, the big kind of anthemic chorus, was an afterthought. That was the product of our producer Peter Wolf. Added that part to the song that I brought in, because as originally written, that chorus wasn't even in the song. Sarah, now, on the other hand, I thought right from the get-go that Sarah had a tremendous commercial potential, and I thought that would probably be the first single. So I was quite surprised, when it was actually the A&R guy from BMG back then, a guy named Paul Atkinson, who is no longer with us. He pushed for that song to be the first single from Knee Deep in the Hoopla, and I was like, really? We built this city as a single? And he said, yeah, and he was right. And so, the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, good thing it was somebody else making the call on that, huh? If your instinct wasn't going to break big. That's very interesting. That's one of those hidden pieces of history on there. And I'm thinking of this also, too. I just had the very odd kind of non sequitur thought as we're talking about Sarah, previously having had on the show John Oates. So I guess I can say now that I've talked to the guy from both Sarah and Sarah Smile. But a very big hit, as was Sarah Smile. Actually, both of them very big. Both of your groups had big ones there with that. And the album absolutely, again, just exploding into the consciousness. I do want to thank so much Mickey Thomas for having been on with us today. Mickey Thomas from Starship. It was tremendous to be able to have this conversation, and looking forward to hopefully doing it again at some point in the future here. Greatly appreciate having had him on the program. Thank you all for tuning in to FDH Lounge mini episode number 336.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the periodic table of elements.